I had 12 hours left to save my father's name, or lose everything to the men who destroyed him. I didn't go to the police. I didn't go to the bank. I went to the one place my father warned me never to enter, the Obsidian Lounge. I walked up to the man with eyes like midnight and a suit that cost more than my house, and I said the words that would end my life as I knew it. I need a husband by tomorrow. Name your price. I expected a no. I expected a laugh. What I didn't expect was for Kang Woo-hyun to stand up, tilt my chin back, and whisper, "My price isn't money, Kendall. It's your absolute presence in my world. Do you still want to sign?" I should have run, but instead, I stayed. And that was my first mistake. Or rather, love destiny. Don't miss what happens when desperation meets obsession. Subscribe to Ari Armour Stories and hit that like button to follow. Kendall and Woo-hyun's dangerous journey. The penthouse smelled of leather and expensive whiskey. Kendall stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection ghostly against the Seoul skyline, and said the words that would change everything. "I need you to marry me." Woo-hyun didn't even look up from the contract he was reviewing. His fingers, long and elegant, turned the page with practiced disinterest. "I know who you are, Miss Rivers." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "What?" "Kendall Rivers, daughter of Jonathan Rivers, CEO of Rivers Global Enterprises. Your company is hemorrhaging money." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and they were colder than the January wind battering the windows. "Your father made some spectacularly poor investments in emerging markets. The board is circling, without a significant show of stability, say, a strategic marriage alliance with a respected family. You'll lose control within 6 months." Kendall's carefully rehearsed speech dissolved on her tongue. She'd spent 3 days working up the courage to approach him, crafting the perfect pitch, preparing for every possible reaction except this one. He'd been watching them, studying them, waiting. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." Woo-hyun set down his pen with deliberate precision. "The question isn't what I know. The question is what you're willing to pay for my participation in this charade. Name your price. Move in tonight." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Kendall thought of her apartment in Gangnam, her carefully curated independence, the life she'd built away from her father's suffocating empire. "Tonight? If we're going to convince anyone this is real, we can't afford a gradual transition. People will ask questions. They'll probe for weakness." He stood, and even across the room, she felt the weight of his presence. "You'll move into the guest wing. We'll be seen together at the charity gala on Saturday. By Monday morning, the announcement will be in every major publication from here to New York." "You've already planned this." "I've planned for many possibilities, Miss Rivers. You're simply the most interesting one to present itself this month." He moved to the bar and poured 2 glasses of something amber and undoubtedly expensive. "Your desperation makes you predictable. But your determination, that's worth something." She should have been offended. Instead, she found herself admiring his ruthlessness. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected only the parts of herself she tried to hide. "I'll need to get my things." "I've already sent someone. They should be arriving with your belongings within the hour." He offered her a glass, and when their fingers brushed, she felt the spark of something dangerous. "Welcome home, fiancé." Kendall raised the glass to her lips, tasting smoke and regret, and the sharp edge of a bargain she was only beginning to understand. Outside, the city glittered with 1,000 lies that looked like stars. If you believe Kendall is playing with fire, hit like and subscribe. The car that picked Kendall up the next morning wasn't the sleek sedan she expected. It was a black armored SUV, with windows tinted so dark they looked like they'd been dipped in ink. The driver didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge her beyond opening the door and waiting with the patience of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. She should have asked questions then. She didn't. The flight to Los Angeles was private, naturally. Woo-hyun worked the entire time, his fingers moving across his laptop with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Every 20 minutes, his phone would buzz. He'd glance at it, type something short, and return to whatever document held his attention. Kendall pretended to sleep and watched him through her lashes, cataloging every micro-expression, every barely-there reaction. He never smiled. Not once. They landed at a private airfield she'd never heard of, and another SUV was waiting on the tarmac. This time, Woo Hyun slid in beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and woody that probably cost more per ounce than her monthly coffee budget. "You'll meet my associate tonight," he said, still typing on his phone. "Park Jin-soo. He handles my West Coast operations. Be cordial. Don't ask questions about what he does." "What does he do?" Woo Hyun's thumb paused mid-motion. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. "I just told you not to ask that." The house wasn't a house. It was a compound. High walls crowned with security cameras, a gate that looked like it could stop a tank, and guards, actual guards with earpieces, and the kind of stillness that came from military training. They drove through in silence, and Kendall watched the manicured gardens blur past. Everything too perfect, too controlled. The entrance hall could have swallowed her entire apartment. Marble floors reflected the light from a chandelier that probably required a crane to install. And there, in that cavernous space, 3 men in dark suits stood waiting. The moment Woo Hyun's shoe hit the marble, all 3 bowed. Not a casual nod. A deep, respectful bow that spoke of hierarchy and consequences. "Sir," one of them said in Korean, his eyes never rising above Woo Hyun's chest. "Everything is prepared as you requested." Woo Hyun responded in rapid Korean, his tone clipped and businesslike, and the men dispersed like smoke. Kendall stood frozen, her overnight bag suddenly feeling very heavy in her hand. Private investor, that's what the background check had said. Private investor with holdings in real estate and technology. Men who invested in real estate didn't get bowed to like feudal lords. "Your room is upstairs," Woo Hyun said, already walking toward the sweeping staircase. "Third door on the left. Don't go into the room at the end of the hall. It stays locked." "Why?" He stopped mid-step, his hand resting on the banister. When he turned back, his expression was unreadable. "Because I said so." The words should have sounded petulant. Instead, they sounded like a threat. Kendall followed him up the stairs, her heels clicking against marble that probably cost more than her college tuition. The hallway was lined with art, real art, the kind that belonged in museums, and at the very end, barely visible in the dim lighting, was a door with 3 separate locks. As they passed, she could have sworn she heard something. A voice, a buzz of electronics. It was gone before she could identify it. Woo Hyun stopped at her designated room and pushed open the door to reveal a suite larger than her entire apartment. "Dinner is at 7. Dress appropriately. We're expecting guests." "What kind of guests?" "The kind who need to believe we're madly in love." He said it without a trace of irony, as if discussing the weather. "Can you manage that, Miss Rivers?" She thought of her father's company circling the drain, of the board members already sharpening their knives, of the 12 hours that had somehow become 3 days, and now this. Standing in a fortress pretending to be a home, engaged to a man who commanded bows like he commanded empires. "I can manage." "Good." He moved to leave, then paused at the threshold. "Kendall? That room at the end of the hall. I meant what I said. Some doors are locked for a reason." He was gone before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving her alone with the locked door and the growing certainty that she hadn't just entered a marriage of convenience. She'd walked into a cage lined with gold and secrets. Want to know what's behind that locked door? Hit subscribe and like to see what Kendall discovers when curiosity finally wins. The courthouse wedding felt like a funeral. No flowers. No music. No warmth. Just the sterile click of a pen signing documents that bound Kendall's life to a man she barely knew. Woo Hyun stood beside her in an immaculate black suit, his expression carved from stone as the officiant droned through the ceremony. When it came time to exchange rings, his fingers were cold against hers, his touch clinical and devoid of emotion. Kendall felt the weight of the simple platinum band settle on her finger like a shackle. She told herself this was just business, just survival, but the hollow ache in her chest suggested otherwise. Woo Hyun didn't kiss her when it ended. He simply nodded once, pocketed his copy of the marriage certificate, and walked toward the exit without waiting to see if she'd follow. The black sedan that picked them up smelled of leather and something darker. Gunpowder, maybe. Or the metallic tang of old blood? Kendall sat as far from Woo Hyun as the back seat would allow, watching the city blur past her window. She wanted to feel relieved that the ceremony was over, but the tension radiating from her new husband made her skin prickle with unease. Then the car jerked to a sudden stop. 3 black SUVs blocked the intersection ahead, and men in dark suits emerged like shadows bleeding into daylight. Kendall's heart hammered against her ribs as one of them approached Woo Hyun's window, his smile too wide, too cruel. He spoke in rapid Korean, his tone mocking, and though Kendall couldn't understand the words, she understood the threat. Woo Hyun stepped out of the car with the fluid grace of a predator. What happened next shattered every assumption Kendall had made about the cold, controlled man she'd married. He moved like violence given form, precise, efficient, terrifying. The first man went down before he could draw his weapon. The second didn't even see Woo Hyun coming. There were no wasted movements, no hesitation, just the sickening crack of bone and the wet thud of bodies hitting pavement. When one man pulled a knife, Woo Hyun disarmed him with a twist of his wrist that made Kendall flinch, then delivered a blow to his throat that left him gasping and broken on the ground. The entire confrontation lasted less than 2 minutes. Woo Hyun returned to the car, without a drop of blood on his pristine suit, his breathing barely elevated. He settled back into his seat as if nothing had happened, but Kendall couldn't stop staring at his hands. Those same hands that had slipped a ring onto her finger, now capable of such devastating violence. "You're safe with me," he said quietly, his eyes fixed straight ahead. It wasn't comfort. It was a promise wrapped in warning. Kendall realized then that she hadn't just married into the underworld, she'd married its most dangerous guardian. And whether that terrified or thrilled her, she couldn't yet say. If you love a protective, dangerous male lead who'll burn the world down for his woman, smash that like button and subscribe for the next chapter of their dark romance. The storm arrived in Chanel and disapproval, wrapped in the elegant form of Woo Hyun's mother, Park Ji-yeon. She swept into their penthouse like winter descending on Seoul, her eyes cataloging every imperfection in Kendall's existence, with the precision of a jeweler examining flawed diamonds. Kendall had faced boardrooms full of men who wanted to diminish her, politicians who'd tried to intimidate her, but nothing quite prepared her for the quiet devastation of a Korean mother who had already decided you weren't good enough for her son. "Architecture," Ji-yeon said, the word dripping with practiced disdain as she examined Kendall's portfolio. "My son builds empires. You draw pretty buildings." The tea between them grew cold as the silence stretched, Woo Hyun caught between 2 worlds, his usual confidence fracturing under his mother's razor-sharp gaze. But Kendall hadn't built her reputation by backing down. She'd done her homework, studied Hainok architecture until she could sketch the curves of traditional Korean rooflines in her sleep, understood the philosophy of Madong and the sacred relationship between structure and nature. When Ji-yeon mentioned, almost as a test, that she'd always dreamed of a cultural center in Seoul that honored tradition while embracing modernity, Kendall didn't just nod politely. She designed it. Right there, over the course of 3 days, barely sleeping, her fingers flying across her tablet while Ji-yeon watched with increasing fascination. The building that emerged was neither purely Western nor traditionally Korean. It was a conversation between 2 worlds, where Hainok elements married contemporary sustainability, where every line showed deep respect for heritage while refusing to be trapped by it. Kendall presented it in flawless Korean, the phrases she'd been secretly learning for months, finally deployed like precision weapons. "This isn't submission to tradition," Kendall said, meeting Ji-yeon's eyes without flinching. "It's honoring it while refusing to be limited by it, exactly like your son does in business, exactly like we'll do in our marriage." The corner of Ji-yeon's mouth twitched, the ghost of approval she'd been withholding finally breaking through her carefully maintained reserve. "You have steel in you," Ji-yeon finally said, switching to English with only the faintest accent. "Good. My son needs someone who won't bend." She touched the design with one perfectly manicured finger, tracing the roofline. "Perhaps I underestimated American architects." "Perhaps you underestimated this one specifically," Kendall replied, and Woo Hyun's relieved laughter broke the remaining tension like sunlight through clouds. But not everyone would be won over so easily. The real challenge was still coming, and she wore Prada and controlled half the city's underground. Want to see Kendall face off against the Mafia queen herself? Subscribe and hit that like button. The collision you've been waiting for is next. The crash woke Kendall at 2 a.m. She bolted upright, heart hammering against her ribs, and threw off the covers. The sound had come from downstairs, glass shattering, followed by something heavy hitting the floor. For a moment, she considered staying put, pretending she'd heard nothing. That was what a smart contract wife would do. But her feet were already moving, carrying her down the hallway before logic could intervene. The living room was dark, except for the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. Kendall's breath caught when she saw him. Woo Hyun was slumped against the wall, one hand pressed to his side. Dark liquid seeping between his fingers. His normally perfect hair was disheveled, his shirt torn and stained. The broken whiskey tumbler glittered on the floor beside him. "Don't," he said when she rushed forward, but his voice lacked its usual edge. He sounded tired. Human. "Shut up!" Kendall dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already reaching for his shirt. "What happened?" "Business meeting that went wrong." His laugh was bitter, cut short by a wince. "The kind your father never tells you about in the boardroom." She didn't ask more questions. Whatever world he inhabited after dark, whatever shadows clung to the Lee Empire's fortune, those answers could wait. Right now, he was bleeding on their floor. She ran for the first aid kit, her mind cataloging everything she'd learned from her volunteer days at the hospital. The wound wasn't deep, thank God, just a nasty gash across his ribs. As she cleaned it with steady hands, his ice-blue eyes fixed on her face. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "Because you're hurt." She didn't look up from her work, afraid of what she might see, or what he might see in her. "That's not what I mean." His hand caught her wrist, gentle despite his strength. "Why did you agree to this marriage? Really?" The question hung between them like the sword that had started this whole mess. Kendall's fingers stilled against his skin, the antiseptic-soaked gauze forgotten. When she finally met his gaze, she found something unexpected there. Vulnerability, raw and real. "I needed to save my father's company," she whispered. "I needed to be more than just decorative." Woo Hyun's jaw tightened. "I married you because I needed something real. Everything in my life is a transaction, a calculation. Everyone wants something from me." His thumb traced circles on her wrist. "But you looked at me that night like I was just a man. Not a conquest, not a prize, just me." The confession shattered something between them. The careful distance, the practiced indifference. When Kendall leaned forward to tape the bandage, their faces were inches apart. She could feel his breath, warm against her cheek, could see the walls crumbling behind those impossible eyes. "Woo Hyun," she breathed. "Stay," he said, not a command, a plea. If you're rooting for this couple, don't forget to like and subscribe. Drop a comment below. Do you think they can overcome their differences, or is this marriage doomed from the start? The email arrived at 6:47 a.m., marked urgent from Kendall's PR director. 3 words in the subject line: "We have a problem." Kendall's coffee went cold as she scrolled through the attached images. Woo Hyun at a restaurant, laughing with a man whose face she recognized from news reports 2 years ago. Kim Min-jae, convicted of embezzlement and fraud. The photos were grainy but damning, time-stamped from last week. By 7:15, they were everywhere. Gossip sites, fashion blogs, even legitimate news outlets questioning Bespoke's judgment in partnering with someone who associated with known criminals. Her phone exploded with notifications. The board wanted an emergency meeting. Investors were concerned. And there, buried in her messages, was one from Richard Chen at Lux Collective, her biggest competitor. "Unfortunate timing for your partnership. Happy to discuss acquisition terms whenever you're ready." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Lux had been circling Bespoke for months, and she'd turned them down repeatedly. Now they'd found their leverage, or created it. Woo Hyun's response came within the hour, clinical and precise. Min-jae was his cousin, recently released and trying to rebuild his life. They'd met for dinner at Woo Hyun's mother's request. "I understand if this complicates our arrangement," he wrote. "I won't contest termination of the contract." Kendall stared at those words, her lawyer already drafting exit clauses on another screen. The morality clause in their agreement was airtight. Association with convicted criminals gave her an out. She could walk away, protect Bespoke, maybe even spin this into sympathy from other investors. Clean break. Minimal damage. Her father would have done it in a heartbeat. Business was business. But she kept thinking about Woo Hyun's face in her office, the way he'd talked about second chances, and seeing potential where others saw problems. About how he'd looked at her designs with genuine appreciation, not just calculating their market value. How he'd shown up for every fitting, every consultation, treating her team with respect that had nothing to do with contracts or publicity. The board meeting was in 2 hours. Richard Chen's offer sat in her inbox like a golden parachute. And somewhere across the city, Woo Hyun was probably preparing for the inevitable, already mentally moving on to protect her from the fallout he'd never intended to cause. Kendall's finger hovered over her lawyer's number, then moved to her PR director instead. "Clear my morning," she said. "I need to make a statement." What will Kendall choose? Her company's safety, or standing by someone who believed in second chances? Subscribe and hit that like button so you don't miss Kendall's decision that could change everything. The private jet touched down in Vegas just after midnight, the city's neon glow bleeding into the desert sky like an open wound. Kendall pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching the strip pulse beneath them, a glittering artery of excess and ambition. Woo Hyun sat across from her, perfectly still in the dim cabin light, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He hadn't spoken since they'd left Seoul 6 hours ago, and the silence had weight to it, dense and deliberate. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice barely cutting through the engine's hum. "A conversation," he said simply, "one that requires your presence." The car that met them was black and armored, windows tinted so dark they seemed to swallow light. They drove past the casinos, past the tourists stumbling drunk between hotels, into the industrial outskirts where warehouses crouched like sleeping giants. The vehicle finally stopped before a building that looked abandoned. Cracked concrete, rusted shutters, graffiti crawling up the walls like ivy. But when the heavy steel door swung open, Kendall stepped into a different world entirely. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed into something between a war room and a private club. Crystal chandeliers hung from exposed beams, casting prismatic light over mahogany tables where men in $1,000 suits sat with tablets and tumblers of amber liquid. She recognized faces from financial news, from tech summits, from shadowy corners of international business. These weren't Woo Hyun's employees. These were his equals, or perhaps his rivals. Woo Hyun's hand found the small of her back, guiding her forward. Every eye in the room turned toward them, assessment sharp and immediate. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, the way they cataloged her dress, her posture, the diamond on her finger that caught the light like a declaration. "Gentlemen," Woo-hyun said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the space. "My wife, Kendall." The word wife landed differently here than it did in Seoul. Here, it was a title, a position, a piece on a chessboard. An older man with silver hair and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow approached them, extending his hand. "Mrs. Choi, your husband speaks very highly of you." His smile was polite, but his eyes were calculating. "He tells us you're the reason his public approval has risen 32% in the last quarter." Kendall blinked, confusion flickering across her face before she could mask it. She glanced at Woo-hyun, but his expression remained unreadable. "She softens the edges," another voice chimed in from across the room, "makes the empire seem human." And there it was, the truth crystallizing in the smoky air between champagne glasses and cigar smoke. She wasn't just his wife, she was his queen, not in the fairy tale sense, but in the strategic one. The beautiful face that made his ruthlessness palatable. The warm smile that convinced the world his cold calculations were somehow noble. If you want to see what happens when someone threatens Woo-hyun's queen, hit that like button and subscribe, because this alliance is about to be tested. The betrayal came from within, as they so often do in this world of shadows and blood money. Jae-sung had been Woo-hyun's second-in-command for 7 years. 7 years of loyalty, or so everyone believed. But loyalty, like everything else, has a price. And Kendall's enemies had deep pockets and longer memories. It happened on a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for how it ended. Kendall was reviewing acquisition documents in the penthouse study when Woo-hyun's phone buzzed once, twice, then went silent. His face, usually an impassive mask, shifted into something she'd never seen before. Not anger, but a cold, terrible clarity. "We need to move," he said, already reaching for her. "Now!" But now was already too late. The penthouse doors exploded inward with surgical precision. Not a full assault. That would have been merciful. Instead, 6 men, professionals, moving with the kind of efficiency that spoke of inside knowledge. They knew exactly where the panic room was. They knew which hallways had cameras. They knew everything because Jae-sung had given them the blueprints to her prison. Woo-hyun fought like something inhuman, all refined elegance stripped away to reveal the brutal violence beneath. But even the Ghost King couldn't be everywhere at once. Kendall felt hands on her arms, a cloth pressed to her face, and the world tilted sideways into chemical darkness. When she woke, zip-tied to a chair in some abandoned warehouse that smelled of rust and old blood, she understood with perfect clarity that she was bait. They didn't want her, they wanted him, and he would come. That was the terrible certainty that kept her spine straight and her chin up, even as her captors circled like sharks scenting blood in the water. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly understand, was what they'd actually done by taking her. Woo-hyun had worn civilization like an expensive suit for years, playing businessman and benefactor with such conviction that even his own people sometimes forgot what lurked beneath the tailored facade. He'd built empires in boardrooms and crushed competitors with paperwork and leverage, all very proper, all very clean. But Kendall's kidnapping didn't just cross a line. It burned the entire rulebook to ash. The man who walked into that warehouse 6 hours later wasn't Park Woo-hyun, CEO and philanthropist. It wasn't even the Ghost King of legend and whispered warnings. It was something older, something forged in Daegu's bloodiest streets and tempered by a decade of brutality that most people couldn't even imagine. His eyes held no mercy, no hesitation, no humanity at all, just the kind of focused violence that made grown men remember why they'd feared the dark as children. Jae-sung was already dead by then, though his body wouldn't be found for another 3 days. A message, written in blood and betrayal. The Ghost King had returned, and hell itself was coming with him. What happens when the monster finally slips his leash? Subscribe to witness the Ghost King's wrath unleashed. Like this chapter if you're ready for the reckoning. The warehouse erupted in chaos the moment Woo Hyun's men breached the doors. Kendall heard the gunfire before she saw him, her wrists raw from the zip ties, her vision blurred from exhaustion. Then he was there, cutting through the darkness like a blade, his face a mask of cold fury she'd never seen before. "Don't look," he commanded, his voice rough as he worked the restraints free. But she did look. She saw him put a bullet between the eyes of the man who'd dragged her here, saw him burn the ledgers that contained every secret deal, every compromise he'd made to build his empire, saw him torch the only copies of contracts that could have destroyed them both. He was erasing his past, for her. The drive back was silent, except for her ragged breathing and the distant wail of sirens. Woo Hyun held her hand so tightly, she thought her bones might crack, but she didn't pull away. When they finally reached his penthouse, he carried her inside despite her protests, setting her down only when they reached the bedroom. "I'm done," he said quietly, peeling off his blood-stained jacket. "With all of it. The deals in the shadows, the games, the compromises. I thought I needed that world to survive, but I was wrong." His eyes found hers, raw and unguarded. "I only need you." Kendall's breath caught. "Woo Hyun!" "That contract we signed," he interrupted, moving closer. "It was supposed to be armor, protection, a transaction." He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. But somewhere between the signatures and tonight, it stopped being about protection. "You're not my obligation, Kendall. You're my choice. Every single day." He dropped to one knee, and her world tilted. From his pocket, he produced a velvet box. Inside sat a diamond that caught the city lights streaming through the windows, a stone so flawless it seemed to hold entire galaxies. "This was my grandmother's," he said softly. "The only thing I have left from before the Empire, before the blood and the deals. The only thing that's ever been just mine." His voice cracked. "Marry me. Not because of a contract or a clause, or because we're trapped in this together. Marry me because I'm choosing you, and I want you to choose me back." Kendall sank to her knees in front of him, hands trembling as they covered his. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, because I already chose you. 1,000 times over." When he slid the ring onto her finger, it felt like a vow, not written in ink, but carved into their very souls. If you've stayed with us through the shadows, don't leave Kendall and Woo Hyun now. Subscribe and turn on notifications to see their next chapter unfold.